Well, this one's been coming for a while. I think I first promised to review this one almost 2 years back, and in fact, the product itself was released back in 2015. That having been said, it took me a while to actually locate a copy of it, and in even more time to read it between all of the more pressing projects I've been dealing with. Even more time still to refamiliarize myself with the history of a game which, although I have enjoyed the few times I have been able to play it, I haven't really stayed current on through the years. But promise I did, and even though it seems that I do let projects go with great frequency, I do keep them in mind so that I can try to complete them when I can, even if it's some time down the line. And with that in mind, I'm finally going to take a look at Ken St. Andre's Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls. Now, Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls is simply the latest iteration, current as of this recording, of one of the earliest and for a time relatively successful competitors of Dungeons & Dragons, originating way back in the mid-70s. According to interviews, the original idea of Tunnels and Trolls was to produce an easier to understand and play game than D&D, but it quickly developed into a remarkably streamlined system with its own feel and certain abstractions that lended themselves to both group and solo play by means of gamebooks. The latter method being so popular that some mistakenly think to this day that the system is only for solo play, which it most assuredly is not. I was actually introduced to Tunnels and Trolls through its 5th edition, I think, right here, this book right here, which was originally released back in 1986, although I actually didn't acquire this until the mid to late 90s. In truth, my own personal experience with Tunnels and Trolls started during the heyday of AD&D 2nd edition, when I spent much of my free time down at the local gaming store. One day, while waiting for my D&D group to show up, I was perusing the shelves and I found this single copy, this little book right here, of Tunnels and Trolls, just kind of tucked away almost as an afterthought between other game systems. In truth, I actually assumed someone had simply put it there and left it there, since it wasn't actually properly stocked. And it is actually a British version, with the price listed in pounds, honestly enough. It's listed at £2.99, which was, I presume, an import, but the store owner was more than happy to sell it to me, just trading them as dollars, and at the time, the difference was actually more than it is today. I think they were just looking to get it off the shelf. Now, it mostly caught my eye due to the relatively small form factor, at least to someone who was used to carrying backpacks full of this stuff around, and I spent a while reading through it, being pretty impressed with how simple the mechanics were, being amused by the intrinsic humor of the writing itself, and also making a few test characters. I even designed a little adventure to try to run my group through at some point, which I could never convince them to do. Over the next few years, I did dig my copy out from time to time to play through a few solo game books when I could find them, but otherwise it pretty much languished on my shelf just for lack of being able to convince my group to run it. Now fast forward to several years ago and I stumbled across Tunnels and Trolls 7.5, at which point I asked myself if it's still a thing, and yes it was. While I didn't get a chance to really get into the game at that point, I did take a look at the mechanics, and I was pleasantly surprised to find them familiar, even if they were changed a few in places. Now, at that time, you have to remember, my game of choice, D&D, was undergoing wild changes to form that I wasn't even sure that I was particularly fond of. In fact, I can tell you pretty solidly that some of the places it was going I did not like. So Tunnels and Trolls, actually resembling how it did back when I first saw the book, was kind of startling to me. It's actually a series that's probably worth a retrospective all on its own someday. But for now, back to the deluxe version, Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls right here. Now, as you can see, it is a much larger book compared to my old 5th edition one from back in the day, but includes a lot more material than simply the system itself. It's a book not only for gamers looking for a system to play, but also for people who had prior experience with the various game books and other products released for prior versions, and wanted to take a look at Troll World, the setting that the system's creator and earliest players shared, as that is detailed in this book. The book itself sits at about 368 pages, with a full-color cover and largely black and white interior pages, with a selection of full-color plates near to the rear third of the book. Those plates detail classic artwork from Tunnels and Trolls history, as well as a variety of maps of famous locales from Troll World and its related adventures. Indeed, a mix of new and classic Tunnels and Trolls artwork is used liberally throughout the book, largely black and white line art, and while all of it is very appropriate to setting up the classic feel of both the rules and the setting described, it can be a little bit jarring from time to time, as the same handful of artists contributed art over a spread of decades, and it is occasionally very glaringly clear where their talents have improved over the years. Now that aside, the bulk of the interior is simple two-column text with a font that seems a smidge larger than I'm used to seeing in a modern RPG book, although my own gradually degrading eyesight is actually pretty thankful for that, since it does make the text easier to read for me. Occasionally, text is broken by artwork, headings, or easy-to-read tables where relevant, as is usual for an RPG book. The writing is usually pretty clear, although at least in the early print run that I used for this review, and I'm not sure how many there have been since, there were occasionally difficult to understand rules passages, and a few rare but glaring editorial errors, whether regarding table contents or the occasional section of out-of-order text. I can't speak for whether these may be corrected in later print runs, if any, or the PDF version, which is widely available. But I will say that even with the errors in place, it is still understandable as to what is meant for the most part. The book is divided into 4 primary sections. The first 11 chapters are the core rules of the game, taking up a little less than the first half of the book, and giving pretty much everything that you need to play the game in there. Indeed, you could easily cut this book down by half and just print a version of this game in digest size using only the core rules, and it'd be a perfectly viable product and probably comparable with the earlier edition book. It should be noted that some of these chapters are merely a page long, while others are substantially larger. The second section in the book is another 6 chapters long and covers elaborations or optional rules and extensions to the game that are basically a grab bag of useful house rules that can be added into the core rules as you wish. Some of these are, to be quite frank, more interesting and useful than others, and some of them, are a little bit less balanced. The third major section of the book is the aforementioned Troll World Atlas, covering the various continents of the Troll World setting, as well as the grand cities of that world. Finally, the last section has 2 adventures in it, a solo adventure and a GM'd adventure, and while I do find them useful in terms of showing how to format a Tunnels and Trolls adventure, I've got my critiques on at least one of them, which I'll get into later. On to the contents of the system proper. Now, the book starts with a typical introductory section that goes over role-playing from the Tunnels and Trolls perspective at its most basic, as well as the overall structure of the book itself. There is a mention of a number of players appropriate for a game, and there are touches of table etiquette mentioned, and then they immediately give way to character creation. The character creation chapter goes over how it uses a 3d6 character generation system. In fact, Tunnels and Trolls, or Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls, pretty much only uses d6 throughout the book, so if you've got a lot of d6s, probably a good system for you. Anyway, you generate 8 attribute scores. Some of them are familiar to general RPG players, while others are specific to the mechanics of Tunnels and Trolls itself. There's Strength, Constitution, Dexterity, Speed, Intelligence, Wizardry, Luck, and Charisma. Tunnels and Trolls uses a mechanic called triples, add, and roll over, and that even applies to character creation, with the added mention that rolling triples while generating a particular attribute enables that character to become a specialist in that attribute, which will be touched on later. The triples, add, and roll over rule carries over even if you roll more triples, so it's entirely possible, if exceedingly rare, to end up with some pretty high ability scores on character creation. Rather than the mechanics common in a great many other games, attributes, I mispronounce that all the time, don't by themselves give bonuses to particular tasks beyond combat. Instead, you get something called personal adds or combat adds, which simply total the strength, dexterity, speed, or luck points that you have that are in excess of 12, and those are really only used in combat. For all other roles, pretty much all other roles, whether you're avoiding something, whether you're trying to accomplish a task, whether you're trying to use a skill, because there's not really any skills in this system, it uses a saving roll mechanic, where you roll 2 dice against a number based on the difficulty of the saving roll minus the attribute in question. So, for example, if you were to try to make a level 2 saving roll versus strength, you'd roll 2 dice and compare them to 25 minus your strength value. In this case, doubles add and roll over, so again, it's possible, if not probable, that you can pass a very difficult save just by getting lucky and rolling a string of doubles. It should also be noted that rather than having separate hit points or mana points, in Tunnels and Trolls you use Constitution as it is for your health, and Wizardry as it is for your magic points. While taking hits or casting spells, those numbers are reduced, although they will eventually heal back to their original values given time or, restoration spells and the like. So it would behoove one to make a note of their normal values rather than editing them directly on your sheet. In fact, most attributes can be reduced by various effects, so the default sheet in the book actually has boxes for your current versus your normal attributes in a particular area. Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls has a few types of characters called classes in other games, which may vary depending on whether you're using the elaboration section. Other than that, the 3 basic character types are the Warrior, who cannot use magic but gain additional bonuses from combat gear, Wizards, who not only can use magic but get efficiency bonus while doing so with staves or other effects. However, they can only use weapons, they only get to use 2 dice of weapons even if they've got a larger weapon. And then Rogues, who can use some magic, but don't particularly get bonuses either way with weapons or magic. They do, however, get additional talents as they level, and they can eventually specialize in either combat or magic, depending on where they want to go at a later date. In the core rules, specialists merely select one of those 3 prior classes, with their primary benefit just being the exceptional attribute roll. The next chapter covers kindreds, or what other games may term races or ancestries. Aside from humans, there are several common kindred, including dwarves, elves, fairies, hobbits, and leprechauns. And although they may have certain special abilities and limitations listed under their descriptions, the major defining factor of all of the kindreds are their attribute multipliers. These are basically used to multiply your starting attributes to their final value, and can make for some truly high numbers in some instances. There's some mention on filling out other character qualities such as height and weight, and then Chapter 3 concludes with a discussion on character progression, including the idea of levels and adventure points. Now, levels in Tunnels and Trolls are determined differently than in other classic leveled RPGs. Rather than accruing experience to level up, you accrue adventure points and use those to instead directly increase particular attributes or gain talents. Your overall character level is simply determined by dividing your highest attribute by 10. Character level does apply to a few basic things depending on your class, but the fact that hit points are handled by Constitution directly and magic points are handled by Wizardry directly means that level is only really used for those specific class-based bonuses. So you can actually decide how quickly you want to advance in level. You can pour all of your earned experience into it, or all of your earned adventure points into one attribute to make sure that you rise in level quickly, or you can spread them out amongst all your reacher attributes, move them all up, knowing that only your highest one is going to affect your level, and that way you can take your time. There are pros and cons to each approach, and it'll depend a lot on what sort of game that you're playing in. The next chapter is all about equipping characters and consists mostly of tables of various weapons and armor and other gear. Weapons in Tunnels and Trolls do set a number of dice of damage each time and are generally divided into categories such as medium sword or heroic greatsword, with specific examples of that general type of sword or other weapon cited as just an aside. Each weapon has a number of dice of damage, as I said, with a strength and dexterity requirement to actually use it, a cost, a weight, and possibly a range if they can be thrown or fired. In the event that a character is dual wielding, the combined total of all of the requirements for all their weapons must be met. Armor too has a strength and a dexterity requirement, cost, and weight, but instead of dice, they absorb a certain number of hits off of each successful round's damage. Some few armor types, like gauntlets or spiked shields, do add additional dice to a character's attacks during a round, and those are listed in the table as well. There are rules for different qualities of armor and weapons, as well as for different materials and so forth, making for a bit of customization for cost, or as an option to allow a GM to put exceptional weapons just within a character's reach. There's also guidelines for weapon and armor damage and repair as well, if the GM wants to add that facet to gameplay. The chapter continues with rules for poison, which all follow a pretty similar format and usage guideline, as well as lists of general adventuring gear for wandering around dungeons and wildlife. Now, Chapter 5 goes into saving rolls, how to make them, and their place in the game. Saving rolls are not only used, as I said, for what you'd use saving throws for in other games, but also to avoid ranged attacks or to accomplish certain tasks, skill checks, and so forth. The fact that saving rolls are calculated by the saving roll level makes them easy enough to figure out difficulties for in a very brief format, and they're one of the main ways of acquiring adventure points, since each relevant saving roll, whether successful or not, nets an adventure point award based on the difficulty and the number rolled. Section 6 goes over simple talents, which are the skill system of Tunnels and Trolls. Not present in the old school editions, they're designed to be relatively transparent, simply making saving rolls to do certain actions related to that talent a bit easier. That way, they can be melded right into the old adventures pretty seamlessly. Most characters do get a talent per level, while rogues get more. There is a sample talent list that gives general guidelines on what should be considered a talent or not, but it's easily expandable, for instance, if you find something that's not covered. Section 7 covers monsters and opponents, and for all of the myriad types of creatures and enemies one might encounter in Tunnels and Trolls, there are really only two major types of creature. The classic way to represent monsters in Tunnels and Trolls is through the MR system, which simply assigns a number which covers the monster's effective, offensive, and defensive capabilities, as well as their hit points, all in one number. As a monster is wounded, their MR is reduced, and their MR is reduced, they get less adds on their basic dice for each round, which are set. Their basic dice are set at the beginning of the round, or the beginning of the fight, but their combat adds, their personal adds, so to speak, go down with their MR. Thus, they become less effective combatants as you beat them down. Now, the other type of monster is a monster that's fully statted with all of the attributes that a character has, and then they basically play like player characters. Combat is handled in Section 8, and there's a few special cases, but overall combat in Tunnels and Trolls is utterly abstract. In most cases, you simply have everyone roll their attack dice, add them up with all their adds, total everything up, and then compare the players with the monster side, and whoever has the highest total wins the round. However, Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls has a few special cases. First of all is spite damage. So basically every time you roll a 6 on your combat die, that's 1 point of damage it's going to get through even if you lose. Missile weapons are also handled a little differently in that they require a saving roll on the part of the firing individual to hit, and then they automatically do that damage to the target that was fired at, even on a success, even if the attacker's side loses the total. Spells work pretty similarly. Combat also covers rules for guns, martial arts, and berserk states, as well as other special considerations, but all of them are simply one or two special cases to an otherwise straightforward combat role comparison. None of them really make combat complexity rise to the level of even the most rules-light games. So combat can usually be handled as a complete abstraction, or, if the GM really wants to, you can make it as detailed as you want and yield very similar results. Chapter 9 covers magic, which is simple enough. Spellcasters simply declare their spells and then they use their wizardry stat to fuel it, subject to certain efficiency bonuses using staves and their levels if they're a wizard proper. There used to be a failure mechanic in some earlier editions of Tunnels and Trolls, but that's been done away with. Then there's lists of spells for each level. Now, many of these spells simply have a name, a school of magic they belong to, a paragraph of description, a cost to cast, a duration, a range to cast, a range of effect, and then possibly rules for powering the spell up. Powering a spell up lets a wizard spend more wizardry on a spell just to magnify its effect, a lot of times doubling it in some way, provided that they are high enough level to do so. If you've got a level 5 wizard, you can't really up a level 5 spell, but you could cast a level 3 spell at level 5 or whatever. This can allow high-level wizards to cast low-level spells at exceptionally increased effectiveness, and thus get more bang for their buck out of their low-level repertoire. The rest of the magic chapter covers things like wizard staffs, but also various minor magic items. Unlike some modern games, magic items are considered rare, unusual, and up to the DM's decision as to what to do with them. So what magic items are offered in the magic chapter are usually not necessarily the lists of like magic weapons and such that you see in other games, but instead are like lesser charms and lesser trinkets, that the kind of questionable items that you'd find in a fantasy market that they may not even work. Of some note, however, are the rules for power batteries, which are important for a wizard, because they can enable a wizard to store magic to use on more powerful spells. Each wizard can only have one battery, and they must empower them personally, so that does put a limit on it, but even the most basic wizard who can afford one is probably going to want one. The chapter concludes with guidelines on making new spells, which is a tricky art form in any game that involves magic. The last chapter in the core rules just gives guidelines for putting the rest of the rules together into a proper adventure or campaign, and is followed by appendices that list spells organized by different methods. And that honestly just concludes the core rules at less than half of the book. The system that as it stands there plays really quickly, and is fairly backwards compatible with previous versions, allowing Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls to run a lot of old adventures with just a few modifications at best. Certainly more readily than the other 40-plus-year-old systems might run their older editions. Now I'll talk more on my view of the system in general in a bit, but let's take a brief look at the rest of the book. The elaborations section is a sort of GM's miscellany of optional rules, and it can be used with varying degrees of balance in various games. They tend to be a little less backwards compatible than other rules are, so should be done only at the GM's own risk if you're using older material. These optional rules include additional training rules for the various character types, allowing for a wider variety of optional abilities, additional specialist types based on what attribute they're specialist in, rules for citizen characters or basic non-adventuring characters, as well as rules for paragons, which were called warrior wizards in earlier editions, and basically function like super rogues, able to fight very well and use magic almost as well as pure wizards and warriors do. There's a section in elaborations on other playable kindreds or monster-type races, and then on to the various languages of Troll World in general. There's rules for extending talents beyond what was covered earlier, making them both more specific and more useful. There are guidelines for making do with miniatures and specific movement on a map, which is mostly amusing insofar as the core Tunnels and Trolls rules don't actually address it that much, preferring to leave it all abstracted and up to the GM. Finally, Elaborations concludes with a set of charts and guidelines for random elements of the game, things like treasure gems, gems found in treasure, calendar months, traps you might encounter, various mounts, and so forth. After the Elaborations section is the Troll World Atlas, which details in varying degrees various parts of the Troll World campaign setting, some of which is known from earlier Tunnels and Trolls adventures, and some of which is detailed publicly for the first time in Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls. It's a pretty decent enough section, although it may be of mixed value depending on whether a group is using their own world or the Troll World setting. The final meaningful section of the book includes two adventures, a solo adventure and a group adventure. These give a good indication as to how to sketch out an adventure or how to play a solo gamebook, but I do have some minor issues with the solo one. The solo adventure is designed for a dead character of all things, and as such really doesn't give much of an indication as to how to play the game as, say, an introductory solo adventure for a living first-level character might have. The GM'd adventure, however, is a solid multi-part adventure that includes both overland adventuring and dungeon crawling, and can be very useful to get a handle on both aspects of the Tunnels and Trolls game. The book finally concludes with various weapons glossaries, and useful for people who don't want to research their own weapon types, and the various indices that can be used to cross-reference material. So Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls it's an interesting system, in that even the adjustments over the years have left it, feeling a little bit clunky, but it doesn't really detract from how fast the system actually plays. And it's close enough to its earliest editions that someone who hasn't played it for decades should be able to pick it up, read through it real quick, and jump right in. It's streamlined enough that it should be relatively easy to teach new players as well. Tunnels and Trolls is basically an example of the Rules Light aesthetic from decades before the whole Rules Light OSR craze was even a concept. Its attention to abstract narrative play is wholly in line, I think, with that philosophy. I personally think it's an excellent system for group play, but I can also see why it garnered such a reputation for solo play. The same abstract elements that make combat a simple contest of total rolls make it very easy to resolve conflicts in a manner that doesn't really give you a reason or much opportunity to fudge your character's positioning or roles, which is a temptation when using certain other full-fledged tabletop gaming systems to play solo. It does make it easy to keep track of things for someone without a proper GM as well, which is always a plus. The lack of lists of complex magic items make it relatively simple to move a character from one adventure to another, all beneficial aspects that contribute to using Tunnels and Trolls as a decent solo experience. For a group, I'd say that Tunnels and Trolls should be considered as an option for any group that's looking to start an OSR-style campaign, especially if you're looking for something a little faster to play than some retro clones out there, or are looking for a system that is similar to D&D, but different, like much different. I do believe that it offers a more robust system than some of the stripped-down rules-light systems that have been cropping up lately as well. If the original intent of Tunnels and Trolls back in the mid-70s was to offer a streamlined and easier-to-play version of the original D&D, even with all the expansions and elaborations that you have accrued over the years, I still say that its modern incarnation fills that role nicely, especially in comparison with some of the mainstream fantasy role-playing games. But also when you compare it to the OSR games that have cropped up to attempt to duplicate the very system that the original Tunnels and Trolls was attempting to offer a simpler solution to. And if nothing else, there are solo game books that are still widely available to this day, and they're still being put out to this day, especially on PDFs, but also in reprints. There are even third-party offerings that crop up from time to time. It's a system that brings back fond memories for me, even if I never got to really run it the way I'd like it to. It still seems familiar to me. Now I feel like I want to get a group together and try and play some Tunnels and Trolls. At any rate, I'm going to leave this review at that. I'll put a link in the description where you can purchase a copy of this one in either hard copy or PDF. This has been the RPG Crawler with a review of Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you're feeling particularly generous, I do have a Patreon at patreon.com/RPGcrawler that goes towards supporting this channel and reviews like this. Until next time, take care and goodbye.